What you're about to witness is the complete and total annihilation of everything Logan Paul has built in WWE, and I'm not talking about some worked storyline or scripted segment. I'm talking about a legitimate dismantling of this YouTuber turned wrestler's credibility, his reputation, and his entire facade of being a legitimate competitor in this business. Last night, after Logan Paul suffered a humiliating defeat on the main stage in front of millions of viewers worldwide, he thought he could retreat backstage and lick his wounds in private, maybe film some content for his social media channel showing how tough he is despite the loss, maintain that carefully crafted image of being the internet sensation who conquered professional wrestling. But Rey Mysterio had other plans. The legendary lookator, the master of the 619, the man who has been doing this at the highest level for 3 decades while Logan Paul was still learning his multiplication tables, confronted Paul backstage and proceeded to verbally destroy him in a way that was so brutal, so comprehensive, so utterly devastating that everyone within earshot stopped what they were doing just to watch this social media star get exposed as the pretender he really is. And here's what makes this entire situation absolutely infuriating to the core, what should make every single true wrestling fan's blood boil with righteous anger. Logan Paul actually had the audacity to talk back to Rey Mysterio, to act like he belonged in the same conversation as a living legend who has sacrificed his body, dedicated his entire life to this art form, and earned the respect of everyone who knows anything about professional wrestling. This wasn't just a backstage confrontation, this was a reckoning, a moment where all the special treatment, all the corporate protection, all the shortcuts Logan Paul has taken to get where he is came crashing down around him when he stood face to face with someone who represents everything authentic and earned in this business. Let me take you through exactly what happened last night because the context is absolutely crucial to understanding why this backstage confrontation was so significant and why it represents a turning point in how WWE veterans are responding to the continued presence of social media stars and celebrity guests who waltz into their world and expect to be treated like equals despite not paying any of the dues that traditional wrestlers have had to pay. The show started with Logan Paul's scheduled match against a rising star on the roster, someone who has been working their way up through developmental, grinding on house shows, perfecting their craft night after night in front of small crowds in towns that most people have never heard of, doing everything the right way and waiting for their opportunity to shine on a big stage. This should have been a competitive match where both performers looked strong and the audience could believe that either person might win, but instead, Logan Paul decided to go into business for himself, working stiff, taking liberties with his opponent, clearly trying to make himself look dominant at the expense of making the other person look like they belonged in the ring with him. The wrestling community has a term for this, it's called being unprofessional, and it's exactly the kind of behavior that gets people heat backstage because it violates the fundamental understanding that professional wrestling is collaborative storytelling where everyone works together to create something entertaining rather than individuals trying to get themselves over at everyone else's expense. But karma has a way of catching up with people who don't respect the business, and Logan Paul found that out the hard way when his opponent decided they weren't going to just lie down and be treated like a nobody by some influencer who thinks his YouTube subscribers make him special. The tables turned, the momentum shifted, and suddenly Logan Paul was the one getting dominated, getting hit with moves that looked devastating, selling like he was barely conscious, and the crowd absolutely erupted because they could sense that something real was happening, that this wasn't following the usual script where the celebrity guest wins and looks like $1 million regardless of whether it makes sense for the story. The finish came when Logan Paul's opponent hit their signature move, got the 1-2-3 count, and handed Logan Paul one of his most embarrassing defeats since he started wrestling. The look on Paul's face as his hand was being raised in defeat was priceless, a mixture of shock, anger, and humiliation that you simply cannot fake no matter how good of an actor you might be. He clearly expected to walk out of that match with his hand raised, probably already had social media posts drafted about his incredible victory, and instead he had to deal with the reality that when you disrespect your opponent and the business itself, sometimes you get exactly what you deserve. Now most professional wrestlers, when they lose a match, especially one where they were working too stiff and got receipt for it, would take that loss backstage, think about what went wrong, maybe talk to some veterans about how to handle things better next time, and come back determined to improve and show more respect going forward. But Logan Paul isn't most wrestlers because he's not really a wrestler at all, he's a social media personality playing wrestler when it's convenient for his brand and his content creation, which means he doesn't have the same relationship with the business or the same understanding of locker room culture and protocols that someone who came up the traditional way would have. So instead of taking his loss with dignity, Paul immediately started making excuses as he came through the curtain, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, blaming the referee for a fast count even though the count was completely normal, blaming the production crew for some imagined technical issue that distracted him at a crucial moment, blaming everyone and everything except his own poor decision-making and lack of respect for his opponent. The entitlement radiating off of this man was absolutely staggering, this belief that the universe itself must have conspired against him because there's no way he could have legitimately lost based purely on being outworked and outperformed by someone more dedicated to the craft. Rey Mysterio was standing in the backstage area watching this entire display of immaturity and disrespect, and you could see his expression changing as Logan Paul continued making excuses and refusing to take accountability for what happened. Ray has been in this business since before most current wrestlers were even born, starting as a teenager in Mexico working for pennies, developing the high-flying lucha libre style that would revolutionize professional wrestling, coming to America and proving that smaller wrestlers could be just as compelling and successful as the giants who traditionally dominated the main event scene, winning world championships, headlining major shows, creating moments that will be remembered and celebrated for as long as professional wrestling exists. This is a man who has earned every accolade, every honor, every ounce of respect through decades of hard work, dedication, and sacrifice. He's mentored countless younger wrestlers, helped elevate new talent, put his body on the line night after night to entertain fans around the world, and maintained a level of professionalism and humility throughout his entire career that serves as an example of how to conduct yourself in this industry. So when he sees someone like Logan Paul acting like a spoiled child who didn't get his way, refusing to show the basic respect that this business demands from everyone who participates in it, something inside Rey Mysterio snapped. Ray walked directly up to Logan Paul and asked him point blank if he understood what he had just done out there, if he comprehended how disrespectful he had been to his opponent, to the referee, to everyone watching both in the arena and at home. Logan Paul, still riding high on his own ego and apparently oblivious to the fact that he was about to get schooled by a legitimate legend, responded with something dismissive, some throwaway comment about how Ray wouldn't understand because he's from a different era and things are different now with social media and modern entertainment. That response was the match that lit the fuse, and what followed was one of the most brutal verbal takedowns in WWE Backstage history. Rey Mysterio proceeded to systematically dismantle every single aspect of Logan Paul's presence in WWE, starting with his complete lack of respect for the traditions and culture of professional wrestling, moving through his entitled attitude that makes him think his outside fame means he doesn't have to follow the same rules as everyone else, touching on his unwillingness to truly commit to being a wrestler rather than just playing one when it's convenient, and culminating in a devastating observation that Logan Paul will never be more than a novelty act, a temporary attraction that people tune in to see out of curiosity rather than genuine investment in his character or storylines. The words coming out of Rey Mysterio's mouth were not the polished corporate speak that WWE usually insists on, these were raw unfiltered truths from someone who has lived this life and earned the right to speak on what it really means to be a professional wrestler. Ray talked about how he started wrestling as a young teenager in Mexico, working multiple shows a day for barely enough money to eat, sleeping in cars and cheap motels, driving hundreds of miles between towns, wrestling in front of crowds of 50 people in buildings with no air conditioning in the middle of summer, doing all of this because he loved professional wrestling more than anything else in the world and was willing to sacrifice everything for the opportunity to do it at the highest level. He contrasted that with Logan Paul's path into the business, getting major matches on premium live events despite having minimal training, being positioned as a serious competitor despite having a fraction of the experience that wrestlers toiling in developmental have, getting paid enormous amounts of money to show up a handful of times per year while people who do this every single night make a fraction of that amount. The inequity of it all, the unfairness of someone getting opportunities they haven't earned simply because they have followers on social media platforms, was laid bare in a way that made everyone listening uncomfortable because these are truths that usually go unsaid in the carefully controlled WWE environment. Logan Paul tried to interject multiple times during Ray's verbal assault, attempting to defend himself or deflect the criticism, but Ray wasn't having any of it, shutting him down every single time and making it clear that Paul had no standing to argue or push back because he hadn't earned the right through his actions or his commitment to the business. Ray pointed out specific instances where Logan Paul had demonstrated his lack of seriousness about wrestling, times when he no-showed scheduled training sessions because something more interesting came up for his YouTube channel, occasions when he half-assed his way through practice because he figured his natural athleticism would be enough to carry him through, moments in matches where his inexperience and lack of fundamentals were glaringly obvious to anyone who knows what to look for. These weren't vague criticisms or personal attacks based on disliking Paul as a person, these were specific evidence-based observations about how Logan Paul approaches professional wrestling as something beneath his full effort and attention, a side project that he can dabble in when it suits his content calendar rather than a craft that deserves respect and dedication. The most devastating part of Rey Mysterio's dismantling of Logan Paul came when Ray talked about what it means to be a professional in this business, the unwritten code of conduct that everyone from main eventers to preliminary wrestlers are expected to follow. Ray explained that when you step into that ring, you're not just representing yourself, you're representing every other wrestler on the roster, you're representing the company, you're representing the entire industry, and that comes with responsibilities that go beyond just showing up and executing moves. You have a responsibility to protect your opponent, to work safely while still making things look believable, to follow the agreed-upon layout for the match rather than improvising because you think you know better, to show respect to the officials who are there to help facilitate the story, to understand your role in the larger show and make sure you're doing your part to make the entire event as good as it can possibly be. When Logan Paul went out there and worked stiff, when he tried to make his opponent look weak to build himself up, when he prioritized his ego over collaborative storytelling, he violated every single one of those responsibilities and demonstrated that he doesn't understand or doesn't care about what it means to be part of a professional wrestling locker room. Ray continued by addressing Logan Paul's response to losing the match, the excuse-making and finger-pointing that everyone had witnessed when Paul came through the curtain. Ray explained that in professional wrestling, how you handle defeat is just as important as how you handle victory, maybe even more important because losses are opportunities to show character and build sympathy with audiences if you handle them correctly. Some of the most beloved wrestlers in history became stars not because they won all the time but because of how they responded to setbacks, how they showed vulnerability and determination to come back stronger, how they made people believe in their journey even when things weren't going their way. But you can't create those moments if your response to every loss is to make excuses and refuse to accept responsibility, if you act like you're above the fundamental reality that in wrestling sometimes you win and sometimes you lose based on what the story requires. Logan Paul's inability to gracefully accept defeat reveals a fundamental immaturity and lack of understanding about how professional wrestling actually works, and until he figures that out, he'll never be more than a carnival attraction that people watch out of morbid curiosity rather than genuine emotional investment. The crowd of wrestlers and staff that had gathered to watch this confrontation was completely silent, everyone processing what they were witnessing because this kind of direct confrontation between a veteran and someone management has been protecting is relatively rare in the modern WWE environment. Usually when there are issues with someone's behavior or attitude, things are handled more diplomatically, through agents or producers who serve as intermediaries, through careful conversations in private rather than public callouts. But sometimes situations reach a point where diplomatic approaches haven't worked and someone needs to step up and say what everyone is thinking, to draw a line in the sand and make it clear what standards are expected and what happens when those standards aren't met. Rey Mysterio took on that role in this moment, speaking not just for himself but for every wrestler in that locker room who has been frustrated by Logan Paul's attitude and behavior but couldn't say anything because of political considerations or concerns about how management might react. Logan Paul's face during this entire dressing down went through a range of emotions that were fascinating to observe. Initially there was anger and defensiveness, the instinct to fight back and argue against what Ray was saying. But as the verbal assault continued and the specificity of Ray's criticisms made it impossible to dismiss them as mere jealousy or generational bias, Paul's expression shifted to something closer to shock and maybe even the first glimmers of self-awareness about how his actions have been perceived by the people he's supposed to be working with. Whether this moment of being confronted by an undeniable legend will actually result in any lasting change in Logan Paul's behavior and approach remains to be seen, but at minimum it created a situation where Paul can't claim ignorance about how he's viewed within the locker room or what expectations exist for his conduct going forward. The aftermath of this backstage confrontation has sent shockwaves through the wrestling community with fans, journalists, and current wrestlers all weighing in on what they witnessed. Social media has been absolutely dominated by discussion of Rey Mysterio's takedown of Logan Paul, with video clips of people who were present describing what happened spreading virally across every platform. The overwhelming response from wrestling fans has been support for Rey Mysterio and appreciation that someone finally said what needed to be said to Logan Paul's face rather than just complaining about him behind his back or in private conversations. There's a sense that this confrontation represented a cathartic moment for everyone who has been frustrated by WWE's continued embrace of celebrity guests and social media personalities who are given opportunities that traditional wrestlers spend decades trying to earn. Ray standing up and articulating those frustrations directly to Logan Paul felt like someone finally speaking truth to power and refusing to play along with the fiction that everything is fine and everyone is being treated fairly. The question moving forward is how WWE management responds to this situation, whether they'll support Rey Mysterio for maintaining standards and holding people accountable or if they'll be upset that he created drama and made their protected celebrity talent uncomfortable. Historically, WWE has been protective of their investments, especially when those investments come with built-in audiences from other platforms that can potentially bring new viewers to wrestling. Logan Paul represents exactly that kind of crossover appeal that WWE values highly, the ability to get mainstream attention and media coverage that purely wrestling-focused content sometimes struggles to generate. So there's organizational incentive to keep Logan Paul happy and continue featuring him prominently regardless of how traditional wrestlers feel about it. But there's also increasing awareness that locker room culture matters, that if you allow behavior that violates professional standards to continue unchecked, it creates resentment and division that can damage the entire organization's ability to function effectively. WWE has to balance these competing concerns and figure out whether short-term celebrity appeal is worth the long-term costs of alienating their actual roster and eroding the standards that make professional wrestling work as collaborative entertainment. For Logan Paul himself, this backstage dismantling by Rey Mysterio represents a crucial crossroads in his wrestling journey. He can choose to dismiss what happened, to write it off as an old-timer who doesn't understand modern entertainment being jealous of his success and relevance, and continue approaching wrestling with the same casual attitude and sense of entitlement that led to this confrontation in the first place. If he takes that path, he'll likely find that the locker room becomes increasingly hostile to his presence, that people stop being willing to work with him or help him improve, that his matches suffer because opponents aren't motivated to make him look good when he doesn't show them respect, and eventually WWE will realize that whatever mainstream attention he brings isn't worth the backstage problems he creates. The alternative is that Logan Paul actually listens to what Rey Mysterio said, reflects on his own behavior and attitudes, and makes a genuine commitment to approaching professional wrestling with the seriousness and respect it deserves. That would mean showing up consistently for training, working to improve his fundamentals rather than relying on athleticism and spectacle, treating his opponents as partners in creating entertainment rather than obstacles to his success, accepting wins and losses as part of storytelling rather than reflections of his real worth, and generally conducting himself like someone who understands they're part of something bigger than themselves. If Logan Paul can make the transformation, there's still potential for him to become a legitimate contributor to WWE rather than just a temporary attraction, but it requires fundamental changes in mindset and approach that we haven't seen any evidence of up to this point. The broader implications of this incident extend beyond just these two individuals to questions about WWE's talent strategy and how they balance maintaining their core identity as a wrestling company with pursuing mainstream relevance through celebrity partnerships and crossover content. Professional wrestling has always had elements of spectacle and entertainment that go beyond pure athletic competition, and celebrity involvement has been part of WWE's history going back decades, with famous actors, athletes, and musicians making appearances and sometimes even having matches. The difference is that traditionally these celebrity appearances were treated as special attractions that enhanced regular programming rather than replacements for it, guests who showed respect for wrestling and worked with professionals to create memorable moments rather than people who acted like wrestling should be grateful for their participation. When celebrity involvement is done well, it can introduce new audiences to wrestling and create crossover moments that benefit everyone involved. When it's done poorly, with celebrities who don't respect the business or aren't willing to put in real effort, it cheapens everything and creates the impression that wrestling itself doesn't matter, that it's just a platform for famous people to play around on when they're bored. WWE needs to figure out which category Logan Paul falls into and make decisions accordingly about how much they continue investing in his presence. What happened last night between Rey Mysterio and Logan Paul backstage will be remembered as one of those defining moments that crystallizes larger tensions and forces everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about the current state of WWE and professional wrestling more broadly. Rey's willingness to speak up and directly challenge Logan Paul's behavior represents exactly the kind of leadership and accountability that locker rooms need to function properly, veterans who are willing to maintain standards and make it clear what's expected even when it's uncomfortable or potentially risky for their own standing with management. The fact that it took this long for someone to finally confront Logan Paul so directly suggests that there's been a vacuum of that kind of leadership, an environment where people were frustrated but nobody wanted to be the one to stick their neck out and address the problem head-on. Rey stepping into that role and delivering such a comprehensive and devastating critique creates permission for others to also speak up about standards and expectations, potentially shifting the culture in a more positive direction where accountability matters and people can't just coast on outside fame without putting in real work. The wrestling world is now watching to see what happens next, whether this was a one-time explosion that gets smoothed over and forgotten or the beginning of real change in how Logan Paul is integrated into WWE programming. Will he show up to the next event with a new attitude, ready to prove that he heard what Rey Mysterio said and is committed to doing better? Or will he retreat back to his social media world, posting content that frames himself as the victim of jealous old wrestlers who can't handle his success? Every choice Logan Paul makes going forward will be scrutinized through the lens of this backstage dismantling. Every match will be evaluated based on whether he's showing improved professionalism and respect. Every interaction with other wrestlers will be analyzed for signs that he's learned something from being confronted by a legend. The pressure is entirely on Logan Paul to demonstrate that he's capable of growth and change, because if he's not, then this incident will stand as proof that he never belonged in professional wrestling and that WWE made a mistake trying to build him into something he was fundamentally unwilling to become.